in the heart of southern Africa, where the Zambezi and Limpopo rivers carve through rugged plateaus, a warrior named Changamire Dombo rose like a storm. By 1684, he led the Rozvi, a fierce Shona people, to a stunning victory over the Portuguese at the Battle of Mongoi. This clash wasn't just a fight, it was a bold stand against foreign greed and meddling, a moment that echoed across the Zimbabwean plateau. To understand this epic, we need to rewind and trace the sparks that ignited the war, the daring moves of the battle, and the legacy of a leader who became a legend. The seeds of conflict, provocations and power struggles. Let's visit the Zimbabwean plateau in the early 1600s, a land rich with gold, cattle, and proud kingdoms like the Mutapa and Torwa, the Shona. People thrived here, trading ivory and gold with distant lands. But then came the Portuguese, sailing from their coastal forts in Mozambique, hungry for wealth. By the 1570s, they had crept inland, setting up trading posts called ferraz in places like Dambarari and Manuka. At first their presence was tolerated trade, brought goods like cloth and beads. But tolerance turned to tension as the Portuguese grew greedy. The Portuguese were more than just traders. They were empire builders, eager to control the gold, trade, and local kingdoms. They made alliances with weaker chiefs and forced them into prazo systems, Portuguese-run estates that turned African lands into private plantations, run by prezeiros, many of them half Portuguese, half African. They demanded tribute, forced people into labor, and introduced firearms into local politics. Over time, they began to interfere with the powerful Rozvi lands, especially in Mongoi, an important Rozvi territory. The Portuguese didn't just trade, they meddled. For instance, they backed rival claimants in Mutapa's royal succession, propping up leaders like Mavhura Mhande in 1629 to make the kingdom their puppet. On top of demanding for the land, they also demanded mineral rights, carving out prezos, estates, and exploiting local labor. Their arquebuses or early firearms gave them an edge, and they flaunted their power, believing African spears and bows couldn't match them. To the Rozvi, this wasn't just theft. It was an insult to their way of life, and saw this as a direct threat. Who was Changamire Dombo? Changamire Dombo, a man whose name meant the rock unharmed by the hoe, born as Chili Samhulu, a humble herdsman in the Mutapa state. Dombo was no ordinary figure. Oral traditions whispered of his supernatural gifts. Some said he could summon rain or wield magical powers. By the 1670s, he had risen as a warlord, gathering loyal followers who called themselves the Rozvi, meaning plunderers in Shona, for their fearsome raids. Dombo's spark came from the chaos of the Mutapa's decline, weakened by Portuguese schemes and internal fights. Around 1670, Mutapa's king Mukombre granted Dombo land and wealth, perhaps to appease him after a clash. But Dombo wasn't one to bow. He saw the Portuguese as a growing threat, not just to Mutapa, but to all Shona lands. In the early 1680s, Dombo made his move. He led his Rozvi warriors southwest, crushing the Torwa kingdom and seizing its gold-rich lands in Butua. This victory gave him a power base, but his eyes were on the Portuguese, who clung to their ferraz in Manuka and Mongoi, deep in Mutapa's territory. The Portuguese, sensing trouble, reinforced their garrisons, like those along the Angwa River, expecting an attack. Their arrogance calling their guns unbeatable, lonely fueled Dombo's resolve. By 1684, the stage was set for a showdown. The Portuguese, with their African mercenaries and Mutapa allies, stood ready at Maungwe, a key trading hub in eastern Zimbabwe. Dumbo, with his disciplined Rozvi army, was ready to strike. The final road to war was not a single event, but a series of provocations, We need to rewind and trace the sparks that ignited the war. Before the battle, storms in the distance. The conflict between Changamire Dombo and the Portuguese didn't begin at Mongoi. It began years earlier slowly, like cracks forming in the wall of peace. The Portuguese had long set foot on the African coast, first as traders, then as conquerors. They came for gold, ivory, and slaves. They made deals with smaller chiefs, offering cloth, wine, and guns, but always at a cost, a dangerous cost. They wanted more than trade. They wanted control. They pushed further inland, claiming lands that were not theirs. They set up brasileiros, Portuguese landlords who ruled like kings in African villages, collecting taxes, seizing cattle, and demanding loyalty. But many of these lands were under the shadow of a growing force, the Rozvi Empire, ruled by Changamire. Dombo, a proud king, is insulted. Changamire Dombo had rebuilt his kingdom after the fall of Great Zimbabwe. He united clans, strengthened his army, and brought law to the land. His empire stretched across present-day Zimbabwe, and his word was law. But the Portuguese did not respect his power. They ignored his warnings. They claimed territory near Mongoi and began threatening Rozvi allies. One of Dombo's vassal chiefs was humiliated by Portuguese soldiers, his cattle taken, his people beaten. Another Rozvi village was burned in a raid. Dombo sent a message, *, your fire has touched my land. You have lit the war yourselves. Still, the Portuguese kept coming. The final spark in 1683. The Portuguese made a bold move. They tried to force Dombo to pay tribute. They believed African kings could be bent like others before them. They sent envoys to Mongoi, demanding gold, and obedience. Dombo refused. When they left, he is said to have whispered to his generals, "If they come again, they will not leave." And in early 1684, the Portuguese came once more, this time not with envoys, but with soldiers. That was the final spark. The Battle of Mongoi begins. Dombo's army prepared quietly. Scouts tracked every movement of the Portuguese. The battlefield was chosen by the Rozvi themselves, a place of thick bush, hidden paths, and narrow gorges. A place where guns could not aim freely, but where warriors could strike like leopards. Mongoi, the trap was set, and when the battle began, the forest roared. Advantage here. The Battle of Mongoi, a day of fire and courage. June 1684. Dawned hot and tense over Mongoi's rolling hills. The Portuguese, led by their captain major, had fortified their ferra, a trading post with mud brick walls. They were joined by local auxiliaries and Munhumutapa soldiers, loyal to a Portuguese-backed king. Their arquebuses, slow to reload but deadly, gave them confidence across the field. Changamire Dombo rallied his Rozvi warriors, thousands strong, armed with bows, spears, and axes. The Rozvi were no ragtag band. They were tacticians, said to use a cowhorn formation, encircling enemies like a bull's charge, a strategy later famed under Shaka Zulu. The battle erupted at sunrise. Suddenly, horns blew. From behind trees and rocks, Rozvi warriors stormed out, surged forward, their arrows darkening the sky. The Portuguese fired volleys, their guns roaring, cutting down Rozvi fighters. The Portuguese fired their muskets, but the smoke from their own guns blinded them, and they were soon overwhelmed by speed and numbers. The clash lasted all day, a brutal dance of steel and smoke. Dombo's men charged 4 or 5 times, each time driving the Portuguese back toward their ferra. But the gunfire took a heavy toll. Hundreds of Rozvi fell, their shields no match for bullets. Friar Antonio da Conceição, a Portuguese missionary, later wrote of a proud enemy who dared to measure his bows against our muskets. Yet Dombo's courage held his army together. As dusk fell, both sides were exhausted. The Portuguese and their allies camped on the battlefield, planning to resume at dawn. Dombo, however, had a trick up his sleeve. In the dead of night, around 1 a.m., he ordered the women in his camp, often unsung heroes in African wars, to gather brushwood and pile it around the Portuguese camp. At his signal, they lit the fires. Flames roared, encircling the Portuguese in a ring of light and heat. Panic gripped the camp. Believing they were surrounded by a massive Rozvi force, the Portuguese, their mercenaries, and Mutapa allies fled into the darkness, abandoning weapons, supplies, and pride. When the sun rose, the battlefield was quiet. Dombo's Rozvi looted the deserted camp, seizing guns, goods, and glory. The Portuguese didn't just lose a battle, they lost their grip on Mongoi. Dombo, battered but unbowed, didn't pursue them. His army had suffered heavily, and a new threat loomed. A mute force, including Portuguese stragglers, was invading his Butua stronghold. Dombo turned west, defeated this force, and killed 5,000 enemies, cementing his power. Aftermath and legacy. A new power recessed Changamire Dombo's. Victory at Mongoi was more than just a battle. It was a powerful message. The Rozvi Empire would not be controlled by outsiders. The Battle of Mongoi was a turning point. It shattered the myth of Portuguese invincibility, proving African warriors could outwit and outfight a European power. Dombo didn't stop there. From 1685 to 1692, he consolidated his hold on Butua, building a capital at Manyanga. In 1693, he allied with the new Mutapa king, Changamire, who sought independence from Portuguese control. That November, Dombo's Rozvi swept through destroying the Pharaoh, killing traders, and even desecrating graves for war medicine. By 1695, the Portuguese had fled most of their inland posts. Retreating to coastal Tet and Sena, Dombo's empire grew, stretching from Manyika to heartlands. His Rozvi ruled through cattle wealth, gold mines, and tribute, blending Shona traditions with military might. Stone-walled towns like Komi and Nalatale rose as symbols of Rozvi power. When Dombo died in 1696, his dynasty carried on, dominating until the 19th century, when Anjoni and Ndebele invasions weakened the empire to the Shona. Changamire Dombo became a hero, a proto-national freedom fighter who defied foreign rule. His victory at Mongoi wasn't just about tactics, it was about pride, resilience, and the will to protect a way of life. Dombo became one of the most respected and feared African rulers of his time. His empire remained strong for decades. The Portuguese stayed away from the Rozvi heartland after that defeat, knowing another such loss would be devastating. Today, his name lives on in Zimbabwe, a reminder of a time when a rock stood firm against the tide. Summary conclusion. The story of the Rozvi king is not just a tale of resistance, it's a testament to African power, leadership, and resilience. In a world where colonial narratives often dominate, this victory stands as a reminder. Africa has always had its own kings, its own empires, and its own triumphs, and it's time we remembered them. Here are a few takeaways. They didn't just fight, they fought to win. And they did. The Portuguese came with guns. The Rozvi answered with unity, strategy, and unbreakable will. History isn't always written by the victors, sometimes it's just buried. Until now, this was not a clash of cultures. This was a defense of legacy. We've come to the end of this episode. If you found this story as powerful as I did, make sure to hit that like button. Really helps share our history with the world. Subscribe for more forgotten legends, and drop a comment. Which king or empire should we cover next?